Hello and welcome to Hump Day. Today I want to move on from yesterday. Yesterday we were talking about some problems that a client was having with the canter work and how the horse was going really nicely in trot, and then suddenly when it went into canter it was showing its head up and basically breaking that nice bubble of communication and stiffening up, and its back was hollowing. So today I want to move on from that. We talked yesterday about how you can fix that problem and where you should concentrate your efforts in order to do so. I also had a couple of other emails about canter this week, so I thought that I'd start with those today. One was that the horse bucks, or actually she said pig roots, but that's a good Australian word, so not everyone will know that. Pig root, for those of you that aren't in Australia, is simply, it's like a buck, but it's not really, so it doesn't have any twist in it or anything, and it feels a little bit like the back end is jumping up, just lifting off the ground a bit. So it's not as hard to ride as a buck, let's say that. And another person who wrote to me saying that her horse always swishes its tail when she asks for canter, and she knows that the horse doesn't like the cue that she uses, but she doesn't want to use a verbal cue because she doesn't like people that use verbal cues, because when they do that, when she's riding near them, her horse responds to their verbal cues, so she tries to keep verbal cues to a minimum. So I want to talk about both those things. My first thing would be when a horse is showing this sort of conflict behaviour like bucking or pig rooting or kicking out, swishing their tail. When you're asking for a transition, then first thing I would do would be check for pain, of course. And I always say this, but it's so important, because if your horse is in pain, then you've broken rule number 2. Haven't you? Yeah, we discussed the other day when we talked about the 3 rules. So it's very important that your saddle fits properly. It's very important that your horse is fit for the job that you're wanting to do. If you suspect that your horse is suffering from some sort of discomfort on its back or something, then please just have it checked. Get somebody professional that specialises in that sort of thing. That might not necessarily be your vet, it might be a specialist body worker, and get them to have a look so they can reassure you that your horse is physically fit for the job you're asking it to do. Otherwise things are going to go from bad to worse, and there's no real point in pursuing it until that's sorted out. So, okay, we'll assume you've done that for the purposes of this conversation, and let's say your horse is still pig rooting or bucking when you ask for canter. Now, my first thought would be to have a less harsh cue. So by harsh, I mean higher in pressure. So if, for example, you have to kick your horse to get it to go, then that's a really high level pressure cue, as opposed to if you have a verbal cue, which is a very low level pressure cue, but it is still a pressure cue. Your voice is still pressure. So that's important to remember that. Now, I try to have a very different cue for canter, a unique cue for canter, and I teach this on the ground before I get on the horse. So if you go through the training material and you do long reining's great because you can get all of these transitions with the horse nice and relaxed and soft and using its back properly. You get all the transitions and the gaits before you get on. And so you know when you get on that the horse can do that because you've seen the horse do that, and you've been holding the reins and you've felt the horse soft, and you see that the horse is round and relaxed and going really nicely, and you say, oh, I can ride that, I want to ride that. And I never get on a horse until I've watched it long rein and I've felt the reins in my hand, and I can feel that the horse is in fact soft in the bridle. It's not leaning on the bridle, and it's nice and it's round. It's in my bubble of communication, and I don't get on until I desperately want to get on. And that was something I said to somebody this week. Don't get on unless you really want to. Watch it long reining, feel it long reining, feel it in your hand and think, can I ride that? Or more importantly, do I want to ride that? Because if the answer is no to either of those questions, then you've got no business getting on. It's not going to be better when you get on. It's going to be worse. It's going to be harder when you get on than it is standing on the ground. So I really encourage you to get good at long reining your horse. We'll talk another day about the difference between long reining and lunging, because people think that long reining is too complicated, which it isn't. Don't go there. And it's really educational, as opposed to lunging, which is just going to make your horse more fit. And something I quite often say is, you know, what is more dangerous than an unfit, uneducated horse? And the only answer to that is a fit, uneducated horse. So don't go there. We'll talk about that another time. So anyway, back to canter and these pig rooting or bucking when you ask for the transition. So first of all, I think a nice verbal cue, and I'd always start with that verbal cue. So for me, I have a cue for walk, which is one single cluck, so like that. Now, if the horse is walking and walking too slowly, so I want the horse to walk faster, then I use that same walking cue, so one single cluck. So if a horse is already walking, I cluck once at it again, it's going to walk faster. It's not going to get confused and say, oh, does she want me to canter? Does she want me to trot? Because I've used the walk cue, which is one single cluck. I do the same thing in trot. So for trot, I use 2 clucks or more sometimes when I'm asking for speed. It's more than 1 cluck. So like that. And if I'm trying to really get the horse to speed up, I might keep clucking at it until I get a bit more speed. But it's 2 or more clucks for trot. And I keep that just for trot. So when I want the horse to canter, I need a completely different cue. I don't want the horse getting confused, because the other thing which is really hard, and we discussed yesterday a little bit, is when the horse goes on that terrible speedy trot and then finally perhaps canters, by which stage, you know, you've almost been bounced out of the saddle, because that's a terrible experience. So I want the horse to go from a nice collected trot into a nice collected canter, which it can do as long as it's got its shoulders elevated, it's nice and round, and it's soft in the bridle. You don't want the horse pulling you forward in that speedy trot and leaning down on the forehand. It makes it very difficult for the horse to canter anyway. So my cue, my verbal cue, which would be the first one I use, has to be unique to canter. And personally, I use a kiss, which sounds like this. It's a funny thing, I'd never heard that before I went to Colorado. Now I hear it everywhere. A lot of people seem to use it, so perhaps we use it in Australia a bit like they do in the US. I'm not really sure about this, but certainly in the UK, nobody really ever used a kiss, or not that I heard of, certainly not in the dressage circles that I was moving in, or perhaps the polo circles. We never used it. So I arrived in Colorado, and there was the dear Josh Lyons, and he was the first sort of cowboy, the first real life cowboy I'd ever really seen. He'd probably kill me for saying that. And he spent the entire day, 8 hours, the first day that I saw him working horses, kissing at him. For him, kiss means movement, move something, move anything. So a bit like I would use perhaps a cluck, he used a kiss. And so I was watching this cowboy, and he said, like this all day long. I thought it was hysterical. Of course, now I don't think it's terribly funny at all. But for me, I save the cue for canter, because it's very different from a cluck. It's very different from any other noise that the horse hears, unless I happen to be kissing it on the nose. And it really, really learns quickly that, oh, that means canter. So when I'm on the ground, or if I'm working in the round pen or on the long lines, and I kiss at the horse, I'm nice and safe there, and I can encourage the horse. If the horse doesn't canter from the kiss, I can keep kissing, like keep your verbal cue up, and then raise the whip or click the whip at him to get him to canter. And as soon as the horse canters, remember, stop cueing. So, you know, put the whip down, stop verbal cueing. So don't keep cueing the horse to canter if he's already cantering, because what you're going to teach the horse then is that the pressure doesn't go away. So you want to stop cueing and wait until the horse makes the mistake of breaking gait, of coming back to trot, and then ask it to cue it to canter again using that kiss. But don't be tempted to keep kissing at it to keep it in canter, because what you're doing then is you're training the horse to get you to cue at every stride, and you end up with, you know, a horse that will be described as dead to the leg, or something like that. If you've ever ridden one of those horses that you need to kick every stride to keep it in pace, you're in gait, that's what I'm talking about. And it's very easy to train a horse to do that. So try not to do that. You know, it's best to let the horse make the mistake of coming back and breaking gait, and then correct it and ask it to canter again. Don't hold it against it. You don't need to punish it. You just need to say, okay, that was a mistake. Kiss you up to canter again, and then leave the horse alone. The horse's reward for doing what you've asked it to do is to be left alone. That's self-carriage. Self-carriage is not about maintaining some pretty frame to put you in the dressage arena. Self-carriage is about maintaining gait and quality of gait without having to be reminded constantly. So I remember when I was competing a lot in dressage, and I had a Danish instructor who used to tell me to wrap my legs around the horse and squeeze, squeeze, squeeze. You know, and I had to do that till I got off the horse. That was what I was being told, that the horse was constantly being held together between my hand and my leg. And there is no release of that pressure. So what does the horse get out of that? I mean, honestly, the horse then thinks, oh, well, you know, it doesn't really matter what I do. It doesn't matter if I canter fast or slow or collected or extended. She's still going to squeeze me. I might as well just stick my head up here and, you know, switch off, which is when the horse goes into learned helplessness. Another discussion. Okay, so that is the first thing I would do. The first thing I would do, having checked for pain, would be to install a really good verbal cue, because that is the cue with the least pressure. I try and have 3 cues for each thing, so I can work up gradually if the horse misses the first one. So my first one is the kiss. I would then touch with my leg. So outside leg back, I have the same cue as I have done since I was 5 years old and had no legs. I still don't really have legs. But outside leg back, inside leg on the girth, and a touch. By touch, I mean just putting your leg on the horse, not squeezing it, not kicking it, not hitting it, not doing anything else, just placing it there. So the horse will feel your leg slide back, your outside leg slide back. That's all it should feel. And I will keep up the kiss cue as well. So I'm not going to stop one cue and start another. I'm going to keep the verbal cue. My third cue is then a slight squeeze with that leg. So the leg slid back along the horse's barrel, and I'll just slightly squeeze it. If the horse fails to pick up on that cue, and I'm still kissing, so I've got the kiss, I've got the slide, I've got the squeeze, then I'll tap it with the dressage whip on the hip. But it's unlikely to miss that cue because I will have trained the kiss cue on the ground first, where I had the lunge whip as well. So I could flick the lunge whip behind the horse to encourage it to pick up speed, and then stop flicking the lunge whip at it as soon as it was in canter. So by layering your cues like that, you're giving the horse plenty of warning. I find the horses mostly pig root or kick at leg, particularly mares, because they've been surprised by it. So it's very hard for a horse to kick at a verbal cue, which is why the verbal cue is so useful. And I know a lot of you are going to say, no, I ride dressage, so I can't use verbal cues. I'm not allowed to talk in dressage. But, you know, honestly, how many dressage tests do you ride every year? Let's have a think about that. Let's say, you know, you're riding elementary level dressage. Let's say that takes about 5 minutes per test. I just want the time in the arena. Let's say you even ride one of those a month. That'd be, you know, 5 12s. It's not many minutes, is it? If you consider how many hours you ride your horse for every week. So by saying I can never give my horse verbal cues because I'm going to spend this 5 minutes once a month in the dressage arena is really unfair on the horse. The horse won't mind if you give a very quiet verbal cue during the test, or if you skip the verbal cue during the test and just slide your leg back and ask for canter like that. But it's no reason to say, I can't ever use verbal cues. And so to the other person that I was talking about who wrote to me this week and said she doesn't like verbal cues because when other people use them, it upsets her horse. Well, again, you know, that horse to me, it sounds to be very sensitive. If it's very sensitive to somebody else's verbal cues, then the horse is a little bit anxious, and I'd be sorting that out first, because if a horse is responding to somebody else's clucking, somebody who's riding another horse, then that horse is really not in your bubble of communication is quite anxious and probably has some other behavioural issues that should be addressed, and I would be addressing those just to give the horse a little bit more confidence, get it in your bubble of communication so that it's not paying so much attention to the other stimuli in the environment. So I think that's it for today. That is the same thing, of course. You know, we're talking about bucking and humping, but the same thing really goes for swishing the tail. The horse is telling you that it doesn't like your cue. The easiest way, the quickest way to get your horse to swish its tail is to put your leg on, especially on a mare. So the less leg you can use, probably the happier your horse will be. And that's why I always start with that verbal cue. So I encourage you to go out and kiss everyone and everything that you see, and I will see you tomorrow with Throwback Thursday. Bye.